In the spring of 1887, in the high sage country of the Bitterroot Valley in Montana Territory, a quarter section of land changed hands 4 times in 9 days, and 3 of those 4 buyers walked away from the deed before the ink had time to settle. The land agent in the town of Larkspur, a careful man named Orrin Pace, had never in 11 years of brokering frontier parcels seen a property come back to his desk so fast or so often. He had sold the homestead in the morning and bought it back by the following afternoon, again and again, until the price he could ask had fallen by half, and the men of the town had begun to call the place cursed. They did not use that word to his face. They used it in the saloon and in the feed store, and on the plank walk outside the assay office, and by the time the 4th buyer came to Larkspur, the word had done its work, and no one in the valley would touch the deed for any sum at all. The 4th buyer was a woman, and she was 28 years old, and she had $4 and a leather satchel, and the tools of a trade most people in Larkspur did not know existed. Her name was Della Vane. She had come west on the rail line from Cheyenne with a single carpet bag and the satchel, and she had walked into Orrin Pace's office on a Tuesday and asked to see the worst piece of land he had on his books. He had laughed, because that was the only honest answer he had, and he had told her that the worst piece of land he had was a homestead. 3 men had already fled, and that he would near enough give it away to be rid of the embarrassment of it. She had asked him how much, and he had named a figure, and she had counted out the coins on his desk without a word, and asked for the key to the cabin and the survey plat that went with it. What Orrin Pace did not know, and what the men in the saloon could not have guessed, was that Della had spent 11 years at the elbow of a dead man, learning to read the things that other people only looked at. That is the heart of this account, and it is worth your patience to the end, for it concerns a wrong that lay buried under a floor for 16 years, and the quiet hand that brought it up. Stay with the story. It rewards those who wait. Della's mentor had been her uncle, a man named Calvin Reese, a surveyor and a builder who had laid out town lots and water rights across 3 territories before a fever took him in the winter of her 27th year. He had taken her in when her own people had cast her off, a girl of 17 with no prospects, and a sharp eye and a stubbornness her father had called unwomanly, and her uncle had called the makings of a surveyor. He had not coddled her. He had set her to work. He had taught her to chain a section line in the cold until her hands cracked, and to read a compass corrected for the local declination, and to drive a stake true, and to find a corner that another man had buried or moved. And past the surveying he had taught her the slower art, the one that had no name in any manual, the art of looking at a building and knowing what it was hiding. A floor that does not ring true under the heel, a wall built thicker on one side than the room behind it requires, a foundation stone set with more care and more mortar than a poor man's cabin would ever seem to warrant. He taught her that men hide things in the bones of the places they live, and that the bones remember, and that a patient eye can read them years after the hand that built the lie is dust. Calvin Reese had a saying, repeated so often that Della heard it in her sleep. He said that the land does not lie, and that paper lies all the time, and that the work of an honest surveyor was to make the paper agree with the land, or else to find out who had made it disagree, and why. She had buried him in March. By May she was in Montana Territory, with his chain and his compass and his level, and a question she had carried the whole way that had nothing to do with the homestead and everything to do with why she had come this far north to find it. The homestead sat 4 miles out of Larkspur on a bench of land above a creek the survey called Pratt Creek. It was a poor enough site, a cabin of squared logs, a sagging barn, a well, a half-acre that had once been broken to the plow and had gone back to cheatgrass and mustard. The three men who had bought it and fled had left their reasons scattered behind them like a trail, and Della gathered those reasons in her first 3 days the way she gathered everything, slowly and without comment. The first buyer had been a young homesteader named Thomas Veld, and he had lasted 2 days. He had come up from the Gallatin country with a wife who had stayed behind in Larkspur until the cabin was made fit, and he had meant to make it fit fast. He told anyone who asked that the cabin would not stay quiet at night, that something moved under the floor in the dark, a dragging and a settling, a slow grinding weight that came and went with no wind to explain it. On the second night, he said, he had lit every candle he owned and sat with his back to the door, and near the small hours he had heard what he swore was a voice, low and worn, shaping a word he could not make out. He did not stay for a third night. He nailed the door shut behind him, which struck the men of Larkspur as the act of a man trying to keep something in rather than out, and he sold the deed back to Pace at a loss and took the next coach south with his wife and never sent for the rest of his goods. The second buyer had been an older man, a widower named Hollis Stam, who did not believe in voices and said so loudly in the feed store the morning he signed the deed. He was a practical man who had buried a wife and 3 children and feared nothing the dark could offer. Hollis Stam lasted 4 days. What drove him off was not sound but water. The well, which had run clear and cold for the homesteaders before him, turned under his bucket on the 3rd morning, the water coming up brown and thick with a smell that clung to the rope and to his hands and would not wash off. He thought at first an animal had fallen in and drowned, and he rigged a grappling hook and dredged the shaft, and on the 4th pull he brought up a thing he would not describe to any living soul, only that it had been down there a long time and was not an animal, and that it had turned his stomach and his resolve together in the same moment. He let the rope drop back into the dark. He too sold the deed back and left, and he did not haggle over the price, and the men who watched him ride out said he had aged a year in 4 days. The third buyer had been a pair of brothers, the Quist brothers, freighters by trade who wanted a base near the rail line, and they had lasted a single night between them. They were big men, unfrightened men, who had hauled R through Indian country and bandit country, and had slept rough 1,000 nights. They would say only that the cabin was wrong, that a man could not draw a full breath inside it, that the walls stood too close to one another for the size the room ought to have been, and that the corner by the hearth sat out of square in a way that pulled the eye and would not let it rest, and that no price on earth was worth a roof that made a sound man feel watched from inside his own walls. They slept the one night in the barn rather than the cabin, and in the morning they sold the deed back to Pace and were gone before noon, and the elder Quist told the land agent to burn the place and be done with it. 3 buyers, 3 different terrors, 1 week, and a land agent left holding a deed no honest fear could fully explain, because the 3 fears did not even agree with one another. One man heard a thing. One man drew up a thing. 2 men felt a thing in the very dimensions of the room. A curse, the men of Larkspur agreed, was the only thing broad enough to cover all 3, and so a curse it became, and the word spread until it had a life of its own, and no longer needed the facts that had birthed it. Della listened to all of it, and she did not believe in curses, and she did not disbelieve the 3 men either. She had learned from Calvin Reese that a frightened man is reporting something true, even when he has the cause of it entirely wrong. The homesteader had heard a sound. The widower had drawn up foul water. The brothers had felt the walls press in. Those were not lies. Those were observations, and an observation was a thing she could work with. She set her carpet bag on the cabin's one table, and she opened her uncle's satchel, and she began, as he had taught her, with the floor. She did it the way he had shown her, on her hands and knees with a candle held low, going board by board, and tapping each one with the handle of a small hammer, and listening to what came back. Most of the boards gave the flat, dead sound of timber laid on packed earth, a sound with no room behind it, a sound she could dismiss and move past. She worked the whole front room that way, slow and no hurry, the candle throwing her shadow up the wall and making the squared logs ripple in the moving light. She mapped the floor in her head as she went, board by board, the way her uncle had mapped a section line stake by stake, refusing to skip ahead, refusing to guess. The hammer handle rose and fell. The boards answered one after another, dead and flat and honest. She found nothing in the center of the room, and she found nothing along the south wall, and she did not mind finding nothing, because the absence of a thing told her where the thing was not. And a map of where a secret is not is half a map to where it is. Then she came to the boards near the hearth in the northeast corner of the room, the corner the Quist brothers had said sat out of square, and pulled the eye. The hammer handle struck the first board there, and the wood answered with a hollow ring, a low open note with a space behind it, a sound entirely unlike the dead flat tone of the boards she had left behind. She struck the next board, and it rang too. She struck the one beyond it, and the hollow followed, a rough rectangle of it, the length of a man and not quite so wide. Della stopped and held the candle still and put her bare palm flat against the cold board, and listened to the corner 3 buyers had each touched the edge of, and none had understood. It was not a curse. It was a cavity, and a cavity under a cabin floor in a country where men buried what they did not want. Found was a thing that asked a question, and she meant to answer it. She did not tear the boards up that first night. That was not her way, and it was not her uncle's way, and there was a reason for the patience beyond mere care. A thing pulled up in haste loses half of what it can tell you. The position it lay in, the way the dust had settled, the order of what sat on top and what sat below, all of that was a kind of writing, and a careful hand read it before disturbing it. So she marked the hollow boards with a pencil, and she ate a cold supper, and she slept by the door with the hammer near her hand, and in the morning she went out to look at the well. The well was the second buyer's terror, and it gave up its secret faster than the floor did. Della rigged her uncle's lantern on a cord and lowered it down the stone shaft hand over hand, watching the small flame sink and shrink and throw its light against the round, wet wall as it went. The shaft was old and well made, laid up in courses of fitted creekstone, the work of a man who knew his trade and meant his well to last. For most of its depth, the stone was uniform, gray and green and slick, the courses even, the mortar the same dark age throughout. What she saw was not a thing of the other world. It was a thing of this one. Partway down, where the water table should have stood clean, a section of the stone lining a few courses high had been opened and reset, and the mortar there was a different color and a different age from the stone above and below it, paler, coarser, the work of a hurried hand, and not the careful one that had built the rest. Someone had taken the well wall apart, put something in behind it and closed it up again, and had not had the time or the care to match the old work. And whatever had been sealed there had begun, after 16 years, to give itself back to the water, slow a little more each season as the lead and the oilcloth failed, which was why the well ran foul under one man's deep bucket and clear under another's shallow one, depending on the season and the level and how far the rope was let down. She did not open the well wall that day either. Instead, she wrote down what she saw in the small bound notebook her uncle had carried, With the knotted cord, she measured the depth to the disturbed stone, and she noted the color of the mortar against the older courses, and she climbed back to the cabin and sat with her uncle's plat of the section spread on the table. And she began to understand that the homestead was not haunted by three things. It was haunted by one thing, hidden in three places, and the three buyers had each stumbled onto a different edge of the same buried fact without ever seeing the whole of it. You may have guessed already that the homestead was hiding more than fear. Hold that thought. What it was hiding had a name, and the name had been waiting 16 years for someone willing to dig. The plat told her the homestead had been filed under the Homestead Act in 1869 by a man named Ezra Coyle, and that the patent had been issued in 1874, and that the land had passed out of Coyle's hands in 1871, 3 years before the patent that bore his name was even granted. That was the first thing on the paper that did not agree with the land. A man could not sell a homestead he had not yet proved up and patented. The law did not allow it, and yet the county record showed a transfer in 1871 from Ezra Coyle to a land and cattle company out of Helena called the Meridian Stock Association, and showed the patent issued 3 years later directly to Meridian, with Coyle's name appearing only as the original entryman, and never again. Calvin Reese had taught her what that pattern meant. He had seen it before, in Wyoming and in Dakota, the same shape every time, traced out for her once on a winter evening with a stub of pencil on the back of a plat. A company that wanted land it could not legally take would find a homesteader who had filed in good faith on ground the company had its eye on, a man working alone, with no wife to ask questions and no kin near enough to come looking. The company would wait until the man had done the hard years, broken the sod and dug the well and raised the cabin, and very nearly proved the claim, because a proved claim was worth far more than raw land, and the law would issue a clean patent on it. Then, the company would make that homesteader disappear from the record in a way the record could explain. A transfer signed and witnessed and filed, all of it in order on its face, and it would take the patent for itself once the 5 years of proving up had run. The homesteader was not bought out. The homesteader was erased. And the difference between being bought out and being erased was the difference between a man who walked away with money in his pocket and a man who did not walk away at all. The difference between a sale and a grave, and the record was built precisely so that no one would ever think to ask which it had been. Della folded the plat and looked at the marked boards by the hearth and thought about the dragging sound the first buyer had heard in the dark, and she understood that she had come to the right place, though for a reason she had not expected, and that the question she had carried north from Cheyenne might be about to answer itself. For the question Della had carried was this: Calvin Reese had a brother, older than him, who had gone west to file a homestead in Montana Territory in the year 1869 and had never written again. The family had decided the man was dead of the ordinary causes that killed frontier men, and they had grieved him in the ordinary way and let him go. Calvin alone had never let him go entirely, and on his deathbed he had given Della a name and a county and a year, and had asked her, if she ever could, to find out what had become of his brother Ezra. Ezra Coyle. Coyle had been their mother's name, the name Ezra took when he went west to start clean, and so the homestead that 3 buyers had fled was the homestead of Della Vane's own great-uncle, and she had not bought it by chance. She had spent a year tracing the filing, and she had crossed half the frontier to stand on it, and she had let Orrin Pace believe she was a fool, buying cursed ground, because it was easier than the truth. Now she had to open the floor. She did it on the 4th day, in the full light of morning, with the cabin door propped wide so the light fell across the northeast corner, and she would not have to trust a candle for the thing that mattered most. She lifted the marked boards one at a time, prying each with the flat bar from her uncle's satchel, working the nails up slow so the wood would not split, because she did not yet know whether the boards themselves were part of what the place had to tell. The nails came up with a long, dry complaint. Square-cut nails, hand-forged, older than the boards they held, reused from some earlier work, and she set each one aside in a row on the hearthstone, in order the way her uncle had taught her to keep even the smallest thing in the order it was found. Under the boards was a layer of packed earth, dry and fine, and she cleared it with a trowel, and then with her bare hands, brushing rather than digging, and under the earth was a second floor, older, a layer of split puncheon logs laid flat side up by a different hand than the one that had laid the sawn boards above. The upper floor had been built to hide the lower one. Someone had come into Ezra Coyle's cabin after Ezra Coyle was gone and had laid a whole new floor over the old, not to live on it but to bury what the old floor covered, and had nailed it down with the dead man's own nails. She lifted the puncheon logs, prying them up at the seam where they had begun to sink, and the hollow the Quist brothers had felt as a wrongness in the corner opened under her hands as a pit dug down into the cabin's earth, a space the length of a man and not quite so wide, lined at the bottom with flat stones. The cold air that had been sealed in it for 16 years came up around her face, earth-smelling and old, the breath of a closed place, and Della sat back on her heels in the morning light and looked at what the land had been keeping under 3 men's feet while they fled from the edges of it. It was not a body. 16 years of Montana earth had seen to that, and she had not expected one, and she was steady enough not to flinch from the absence. What lay in the pit was a strong box, iron, rusted at the corners, the kind a freighting company used for payroll and papers, and around it the things a careful man hides when he knows he is in danger and has one chance to leave a record behind. There was a tin of papers wrapped in oilcloth. There was a surveyor's compass, the twin of her uncle's, for the 2 brothers had learned the trade from the same master. And there was a slate, the kind a schoolchild used, and scratched into the slate in a hand pressed hard enough to last were words Ezra Coyle had left for whoever might one day be willing to dig. She read them in the morning light, kneeling, and she did not weep, because that was not her way. But she stayed very still for a long time. The slate said that Ezra Coyle knew the men of the Meridian Stock Association meant to take his land and his life together, that they had already taken 2 homesteaders north of him the same way, that he had hidden his proof in the well and his papers under the floor, and that if he was found gone, the man to look at was the association's agent, a man whose name Ezra had scratched and then, it seemed, had time only to begin before he was interrupted. The name on the slate was incomplete. It said only the first letters. It said P.A.C. Della knelt in her great-uncle's cabin and understood that the land agent who had sold her the cursed homestead, the careful man named Orrin Pace, was very likely the son of the man who had buried Ezra Coyle, or the man himself under a younger face, and that the homestead had come back to Pace's desk 3 times in a week, not because it was cursed, but because it was working, the way a wound works, pushing toward the surface the thing that had been driven into it, until the right hand came to draw it out. She did not go to town that day, or the next. She did what her uncle had taught her to do with the thing that mattered, which was to make it undeniable before she let it out of her hands. She opened the well wall, carefully, stone by stone, and behind the reset section she found the second tin, sealed in lead, and inside it the original filing receipts and the proving up affidavits in Ezra Coyle's hand, dated and witnessed, that showed beyond any clerk's argument that Ezra Coyle had been alive and on his land in 1872, a full year after the record claimed he had sold it and left, paper against paper. The land's paper against the company's paper, and the land's paper was true. She copied everything in her own careful hand, 2 copies of each, the way Calvin Reese had taught her, because a single document can be lost or burned or quietly removed from a file by a clerk who has been paid. But 2 documents in 2 places are a far harder thing to kill. She worked at the cabin table for the better part of 3 days, the originals weighted flat with stones, transcribing each line and noting at the foot of each copy where the original had been found and on what date and in whose presence, so that the copies would carry their own chain of truth. A plat of the cabin came next, showing the false floor and the pit beneath it, measured and drawn to scale, every dimension noted in feet and inches in the margin. For the well, she made a drawing in elevation, marking the courses of original stone and the reset section between them, the depths taken with her knotted cord. The slate she wrapped in flannel and packed in a box of straw so the scratched letters would not be rubbed away in the saddle. And only when she had built the whole structure of it, fact resting on fact like a course of well-laid stone, each piece holding up the one above it, did she load it onto a borrowed mule and carry it down to Larkspur and past Larkspur east. Here the account slows, and it should. For what Della did next, she did without raising her voice once. She did not go to Orrin Pace. She went to the county seat, 2 days' ride east over the divide, to the federal land office, because the wrong that had been done to Ezra Coyle was a federal wrong, a fraud against the Homestead Act itself, and the men who could undo it did not sit in Larkspur and could not be reached through Larkspur. She laid her copies before a land office examiner, a tired man named Whitfield, who had spent 30 years behind a counter watching companies do to homesteaders exactly what the Meridian Stock Association had done to Ezra Coyle, and who had learned to recognize the shape of it, and had almost never been handed proof he could act on. Suspicion he had in plenty. Proof he had never had, because proof was the thing these companies were most careful to bury. She set the documents before him in their order: the filing receipt, the proving up affidavit with its witness date, the transfer dated a year too late, the plat of the false floor, the drawing of the reset wellstone. He put on a pair of spectacles and read the affidavits slowly, twice. He read the slate, which she had brought wrapped in flannel and unwound on his counter, the scratched letters catching the light. He looked at the plat of the false floor for a long time without speaking, his finger resting on the rectangle she had drawn to scale. And he asked her one question, which was how she had known to look at a thing 3 buyers had run from without understanding. And she told him the truth, that her uncle had taught her that the land does not lie, and paper does, and that she had come to make the paper agree with the land. The Meridian Stock Association had dissolved years before, its partners scattered, but the land it had taken by fraud did not dissolve with it, and the patents it had stolen could be voided, and the examiner Whitfield set about the slow federal work of voiding them. It took the better part of 2 years. Della did not stay to watch all of it. She had one more thing to do, and it was the thing that mattered most to her, and it had nothing to do with the courts. She found the descendants of the 2 homesteaders Ezra Coyle's slate had named, the 2 men taken north of him before him. One had left a daughter, grown now, married to a wheelwright in a town called Conroy, a woman named Sarah Tell, who had grown up believing her father had abandoned the family and gone to ruin somewhere in the mountains. Della rode 2 days to Conroy and found the wheelwright's shop by the sound of it, and sat in Sarah Tell's kitchen at a scrubbed pine table with a pot of coffee going cold between them, and laid the papers out one at a time: the filing receipt, the proving up affidavit with the witness date, the transfer that had erased him dated a year after the affidavit proved he was still alive and working his ground. She laid them in order and let the order do the speaking, the way the floor and the well had spoken to her. fact resting on fact. She told Sarah Tell that her father had not abandoned anyone, that he had filed in good faith and proved up his land and been struck from the record by men who wanted it, and that the record was going to be set right and the land restored to his heirs. Sarah Tell did not say much. She was a woman near 40 with flour on her forearms and a child's voice calling from the yard, and she picked up the affidavit with her father's name on it and held it in both hands, and she ran her thumb slow across the witness date the way a person reads a thing they cannot quite let themselves believe. She said, in a voice quiet but firm, that she had spent 30 years ashamed of a man who had done nothing wrong, that she had been taught to be ashamed of him as a girl and had taught it to herself ever since. And Della told her that the shame had never belonged to her, that it had belonged to other men all along, and that she could set it down now and need not pick it up again. Sarah Tell folded the affidavit along its old creases and held it against her apron, and outside the child called again, and she rose to answer it, and at the door she stopped and said only, "Thank you," and that was the whole of it. That was the restitution, and it was the part Della cared for. Not the voided patents, not the land that came back to the heirs, though it did in time, parcel by parcel, as the federal office ground through the work. What she cared for was the kitchen in Conroy, and the woman setting down a weight she had carried for 30 years. As for Orrin Pace, the account does not give him a confrontation, because there was none. Della never accused him of anything. She did not have to. The examiner's office subpoenaed the county records, and the transfers traced back through the years to the Meridian Stock Association, and the association's agent of record in 1871 was found in the old papers to have been a young man named Orrin Pace, who had signed the false transfer of Ezra Coyle's homestead in a hand that had grown only a little shakier in 16 years. The federal office did its work. Pace was not hanged and was not shot and was not dragged through the street, for that was not how this ended and not how the law moved. He was named in the findings. His signature was matched. And one morning the people of Larkspur woke to find the land office in town closed, and the careful man gone south on the coach, the way the buyers he had cheated had gone south before him, and his name became in that valley a thing said quietly, the way the word cursed had once been said, and for a better reason. The homestead on Pratt Creek was restored to the heirs of Ezra Coyle, which is to say it came in part to Della, who was his blood, and who had proved the claim with her own hands and her own copied paper. She did not sell it. She did not get rich from it, though the men in the saloon had been sure that anyone fool enough to buy cursed ground was after a buried fortune, a cache of coin or a vein of color. The 3 frightened buyers had been too craven to dig for, and in a sense they had been right that the ground held a fortune, and in every way that mattered they had been wrong about what it was. The fortune in the ground was not gold. It was the truth of a man's good name, returned to him 16 years too late to do him any good, and exactly in time to do his kin a great deal. It was a slate scratched in the dark by a frightened, honest hand that had known it was running out of time and had spent its last care not on escape, but on leaving a record. And it was the proof that the land had kept faith with Ezra Coyle, even after the men of the law had not, had held his papers dry behind its well-stones, and his story sealed under its floor, and had pushed, season after season, the only way it could, until it drove 3 buyers off and drew the one buyer in who would finally kneel down and dig. Della stayed in the valley. She mended the well wall with new stone, fitting each course as her uncle had taught her, matching the old work so a stranger would never know it had been opened. The false floor she took up entirely and laid clean, level and true, and she burned the puncheon logs that had been nailed down over a dead man's pit. She lived in the cabin her great-uncle had built, and she put up a marker on the bench above Pratt Creek, a plain stone she had dressed herself with a chisel and a steady hand, cut with Ezra Coyle's name, and the 2 dates that the land office had at last agreed were true, the year he filed his claim in good faith, and the year, near enough, that he had died on the ground he had earned and never been allowed to keep. The men who had fled the place came to hear, in time, what it had really held, and the homesteader Thomas Veld wrote her a letter saying he was glad now he had not stayed, for the place had not been waiting for him. The widower, Hollis Stam, came back through the valley once and stood at the new well and drank from it and said the water was sweet and tipped his hat and rode on. The Quist brothers never came back, but the story reached them, and that was enough. The doubters of Larkspur did not apologize, because that is not a thing such men do, but they came around in their fashion, which was to stop saying the place was cursed and to start saying that the woman who had taken it had known something the rest of them had not. They were right about that. She had known how to look. She had known that a sound in the dark and a foul well and a corner that pressed too close were not 3 curses, but one buried truth, asking, the only way a buried truth can ask, to be brought up into the light. Calvin Reese had told her once, on a cold night with a section line half-chained and the lantern guttering, that most things men called mysteries were only questions no one had been patient enough to answer. She had been young then and had not fully understood him. She understood him now. The homestead had not been cursed. It had been telling the truth the whole time, in the only language a piece of land has, the language of weight and water, and the way a thing rings hollow when there is something underneath it. And 3 men had heard it speak and had run from the sound, and 1 woman had knelt down and listened until she understood the words. If you have ever known a truth that no one would dig for, you may understand why she stayed. Tell me, in your own quiet way, whether you would have knelt down and listened or run with the others into the southbound dark. On the bench above Pratt Creek the marker still stands, and the well runs clean, and inside the cabin near the hearth where the floor once rang hollow, Della kept her uncle's compass beside its twin, the 2 surveyor's instruments side by side on a shelf she had built, the brothers' tools reunited after 16 years and a continent of distance. She would take them down sometimes in the evening and hold the worn brass in her hands, the metal warmed by the lamp and by her grip, and she would think of 2 men who had learned the same trade and believed the same plain thing, that the land does not lie and paper does all the time, and that the work of an honest hand is to make them agree. The light would fail. The valley would go dark, and the woman who had listened would set the compasses back on the shelf and bank the fire and sleep without a sound to trouble her in the quiet house that had finally been allowed to tell the truth.